Hi everyone, my name is Ben Bland. I'm the director of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. Thanks so much for joining us today for this seminar where we're going to be discussing a new research paper by my colleague Yu Jie and speaking about the broader question of China's drive for technological and scientific self-reliance under Xi Jinping, and looking at some of the new leaders who've been elevated to the Politburo in the last few months, and thinking about what their arrival at the peak of the Chinese political system means for the future direction of China's economy and China's elite politics. I'm delighted to be joined by three esteemed experts to discuss these topics. Firstly, we have my colleague, of course, Yu Jie, our Senior Research Fellow for China, who is the author of China's New Scientists. That's the paper we published in the last week, and we'll be sharing the link to the paper in the chat so you can have a read there. We're also lucky to have Neil Thomas joining us from Washington, DC. He's the Fellow for Chinese Politics at the Asia Society Policy Institute. And we have Olivia Zheng, who's a Research Fellow at the SOAS China Institute in London. So thanks, Yu Jie, Neil, and Olivia for joining us today. All their bios are online, so I urge you to go and read there if you want to know about many of their stellar achievements, but we're going to get straight into the meat of the discussion. As I said, this is a Chatham House webinar, but it's not under the Chatham House rule. This is on the record, and we'll be putting a recording of the event on our website and on YouTube later. I'm going to talk to the panelists for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to save a lot of time for all your questions. So if you want to ask a question, please do it using the Q&A function at any time throughout the discussion, and we'll come to them towards the end of our time. But we're keen to hear as many of your thoughts as possible. With no further ado, I'm going to go to Yu Jie first to tell us a bit more about her paper. And really, I guess, Yu Jie, what would be helpful is if you can highlight for us the key findings of your research on these new scientists and what they're there and what they're there for and what they're trying to achieve. Yu Jie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ben. Good day for anyone. Depends on what time you join from where you're located. Welcome to Chatham House again. I'll talk about China this time. And obviously, what I'm doing in the next 10 minutes or so is to walk through with you on the certain key characters of this latest edition of the Chinese Politburo and who they are, and what they have done and earned them a position in this Politburo. And interesting enough, as we said, we are doing a very interesting research paper. So it's not really a sci-fi journal that you have the sci-fi novel. You have the participation of nuclear scientists, rocket scientists, and space scientists. But instead, we're talking about actually scientists turned into politicians, and which are going to rule the world's second largest economy, at least in the next decade. So what do we have? So obviously we do have a new Politburo has been appointed, and then also we have China's very keen policy on technology and scientific self-reliance. And then of course, we will also be looking at international implications. What does those appointment mean to the international politics and also for the so-called ever intense US-China relations? And that's broadly the report has been covered. Now, let me go through the most interesting bit in here is that as far as I remember, and I'm sure Neil and Olivia would be the same, back to 7 months ago, 10 months ago, actually, for the Party Congress, feels like nearly a year. Much of the attention for international media has been given to Xi Jinping record-breaking third term as the Chinese president, but also he has appointed all this loyalists around him, so-called the Standing Committee of Politburo. But very little attention has been given to the second most important political institution, political club of the country, namely the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. And what I found quite interesting is that among the team of 24, which is the total number of Politburo these days, and they are among 11 new entrants among this edition of Politburo. And interestingly, out of those 11 new entrants, and 5 of them have a very substantial background, being a leading scientist in their own specific field. which is rather unprecedented compared with any of the previous Politburos we would have ever since 1979, because the tradition in the past has always been you have plenty of economic planners, usually around 2 or 3 in numbers, and you have other local bureaucrats and long-standing local officials. But instead, what we didn't have for this 20th Party Congress Politburo is we have a substantial number, 5 very important scientists to be sitting on that position. And what does it really tell us about Xi Jinping's policy and priorities that he has in mind? And obviously that led us into this 2 very key questions. Firstly, can the Chinese economy and China itself withstand the geopolitical or geoeconomic external shock? And secondly, can China achieve that long desired sense of technology and self-innovation, self-reliance? And obviously the answer were very unclear until this stage, but clearly given the appointment of those 5 very key scientists, that is really indicate and signal that Xi Jinping want to make these 2 items as being a priority for his 3rd term in the office. And who are they in here? Now, interesting within the report, you have seen so far, I'm just going to sum up some of the commonalities these people have. So out of those 5 new members, 4 of them with a substantial PhD degree in science. So you have Yuan Jiajun and Ma Xingrui being the space and the rocket scientist. And these are 2 people who have been the chief architect for China's space program. And then you have Chen Jining, again, probably is the highest degree, the person who holds his highest degree of the returned Chinese students who studied abroad. And he earned his PhD at Imperial College in London back to 30 years ago, and then now become the party secretary of Shanghai. But he used to head China's most prestigious Tsinghua University, which again is another hub for science and innovation. Then you also had Dr. Li Ganjie, and who is a nuclear scientist and who's by chance is fluent in French. Interesting enough, this is also the person that facilitated and drove China's civil nuclear technology into on a par almost with, like, for example, France. And then you also have Zhang Guoqing, which is the only person who hasn't got a PhD among this group in here, but is an industrial military specialist in here and try to work out how China's missile systems work. So you have all these 5 scientists and who are really fluent in at least 1 foreign languages, and at least have really substantial achievement within their respective field of science. And beyond that, when they entering in politics, and most of them entering the politics in the time around 2012, 2013 onward, when during the Xi Jinping's 1st term. And what we have is that those 5 officials have introduced some kind of scientific programs to roll out throughout the provinces which they're in charge. For example, Yuan Jiajun, when he was in charge of Qinghai province, and he managed to get this energy transitioning happen within Qinghai and try to reintroduce some sense of renewable energy, something that very difficult to roll out across the geography. So this is something what they have done, and by earning them the stripe, having gained a seat at the Politburo beyond just the loyal to Xi Jinping, but instead they have now become what I call it the sophisticated enablers to deliver Xi Jinping's heavy agenda on scientific self-reliance. Now, perhaps some of the long-term China watchers might criticize me in here by saying it is not an entirely new phenomenon by appointing technocrats within the Chinese Politburo. Now, what really I think distinguished the present generation as a collective from their predecessors. For example, you have Jiang Zemin and Li Peng, who were the predecessors and previous generation technocrats focusing on civil engineering and hydrogen engineering. But it's really the scale and the level of seniority among those 5 people representing China's political institution these days, but also in their own respective field, they have been the pioneer of those industries, science, missiles, civil nucleus, and so on and so forth. So this really explained to me somehow, yes, Xi Jinping may clearly aware the difficulties of achieving that sense of scientific self-reliance, but then on the other hand, by appointing those 5 people, that is already offer a quite heavy clue on what he wanted to do. So that is the Politburo what we have so far. Now we also have the policies in here. Interesting enough, yeah, what we have seen is the question I would have in here is many of those scientists who have been appointed, of course, they have been well connected with the rest of the world. And really among those 5 of them have either studied or worked substantially abroad. I think it's really because of that international connection and remain connected with the Western advanced economy, and that led into their scientific success. Now, the question really for here is that, fine, this is going to test in China's limits and how far this self-sufficiency, the drive likely to go further if China decided solely, singly rely on the self-reliance on scientific innovation, done it domestically by itself. Now, another very interesting element, what I found throughout this report, is that given the current ongoing geopolitical tension happening between China and United States, and China, because of all these tensions and targeted, I think, Chinese working abroad on the scientific sector, China has now become a net importer of scientific and technology talents. So not necessarily the exporter anymore in the past, but by 2021, China become technology and talent net importer. And then of course, the infrastructure, what it means, the physical institution and the financial resources offer for those scientists are available there. For example, a typical salary for a junior middle level researcher was in China, if you studied abroad and worked abroad and returned to China, is around $150 a year, as $150,000 a year as your annual salary, and then plus a property and also reasonable social welfare. So it's quite a generous offer for it. And obviously for infrastructure is there. But really the question in here is the space. What I mean by space is really the space, the ability to have that sense of creative thinking, critical thinking, and the ability to be able to challenge the conventional wisdom, which would bearing the fruit of scientific innovation. And I also question whether it's going to be there or not. Now,
Eugene, I might just jump in there. I mean,
Sure.
I think we're going to come back to that question in a second of the tension between the desire to drive kind of innovation and effectively China cutting itself off from the world, and how it's gonna develop and get the access to kind of innovation, technology, information from abroad while links are being cut off. But before we go there, I want to come to you, Neil, to expand a bit on this question of who's driving China's science and technology policy and how, because of the 5 scientists that Yujie has mentioned, they all have another job. So they sit on the Politburo, but variously they're also the party secretaries of 2 of China's most important cities, Shanghai and Chongqing, Xinjiang, one of the most sort of troublesome provinces from the party's perspective. And then we have other kind of central roles as well. So how are these individuals meant to be combining their day jobs with this kind of science role on the Politburo, Neil? And ultimately, who's deciding China's science and technology policy? Is it all about Xi Jinping? Are there other sort of structures, and what role do these individuals play in those kind of policy structures?
Thanks, Ben. It's a great and a very big question, because I mean, when we talk about science and technology policy, we're talking about a whole host of different things, like going from policy on basic research at universities to policies about building a new electric vehicles industry and everything in between. So in terms of thinking about the influential actors there, I think that, I mean, Yujie's paper does a great job of identifying people who are going to be at these monthly meetings of the Politburo, who are going to have a particular voice in those discussions at the highest level, and whose input on science and technology policy we can assume is going to carry somewhat more weight, especially on kind of some of the more technical and specialist questions. I think that you're right to mention Xi Jinping is kind of mandatory in any discussion of China right now. I mean, he is, as far as we can understand, the decisive actor in terms of having the final word on any top-level policy, which would include science and technology policy. I think it's clear from his speeches and events over the last decade plus he's been in power that he personally believes that China needs to become a science and technology superpower, especially given this new strategic context in the last few years of intensifying competition over technology with the United States and with US allies. But if we go kind of further down the system, in terms of where the rubber hits the road, and the Chinese government, the political system kind of processes developments in real world technology, hears from experts in academia and in industry. I mean, there's a lot of that type of action happening in kind of relatively powerful bureaucracies at the ministerial level that are kind of acting as these clearinghouses for implementing these top level guidances that come from above, from Xi Jinping and from the Politburo, but also helping to shape the direction of that policymaking at the top, because they kind of bring more focus and more expertise. So places like the Ministry of Science and Technology that kind of formulates kind of national plans for scientific and technological research, the Ministry for Industry and Information Technology that kind of looks more like where the rubber hits the road in terms of applying science and research to the economic realm and actually developing some of these new industries and information technology. In terms of the internet specifically and kind of emerging digital technologies, the Cyberspace Administration of China is a really powerful actor in that space. There's also places like the Ministry of Public Security, which basically runs the police force, that has jurisdiction over the what's called the multi-layer protection scheme, basically the cybersecurity regime that all kind of companies and government actors have to comply with in China. There's the State Administration of Market Regulation, which is in charge of things like anti-monopoly and industrial standards as well, which have got a lot of attention. And then there's kind of the super ministry, like the National Development and Reform Commission, that's in charge of the overall economic planning process, which also has a kind of innovation and high-tech development bureau, which kind of feeds into the overall planning for how China goes about its science and technology policy. And there are many more actors in kind of the think tank space and academia, other government ministries, but that's just kind of a basic run through of some of the key bureaucratic power centers when it comes to actually giving the options, feeding the information, and helping Xi and these new scientists to set the direction going forward. And interestingly, the last thing I'll say about this is that all of these ministries, perhaps with the exception of the National Development and Reform Commission, are led by technocrats, a lot of information and electronic engineers who've had significant industry experience. So I think we can extrapolate, go even further with Yujia's argument that when it comes to science and technology policy, Xi Jinping is, political loyalty is just a baseline requirement at this point, but is, serious about appointing people who at least know something about what they're trying to do. And that's, another reason to take seriously his ambitions for at least making significant progress on Indigenous innovation.
Thanks, Neil. And it's a good point because there's so much focus on this loyalty question, but it's better to think of it probably as a necessary but not sufficient condition for moving up the ladder. And it's clear and it's often overlooked that there's a desire to put people in these key positions who know what they're doing. Olivia, I want to come to you next because I know you've studied Xi Jinping thought, so thank you for that. So the rest of us don't have to. Where does this sort of sense of indigenous innovation, is this a kind of key part of how Xi Jinping sees the world, or is this more reactive to the kind of sanctions and limitations that the US and other allies have put on China in the last few years to curb China's access to high technology goods and people with that kind of information?
Thank you for the question, Ben. I think there are definitely, both elements there. It is reactive and it's not only reactive. The idea about decoupling China's essential technologies from the West by reducing dependence has been a long-standing agenda that Xi Jinping wants to pursue. Now, US sanctions over China, which is followed by other countries, simply, increase his anxieties and affirm that he is doing the right thing. But what I really want to focus here is that indigenous innovation is the goal that Xi Jinping and China wants to achieve. it is never meant to be the means to achieve, self-sufficiency. But what Xi Jinping really has in mind is China would achieve indigenous innovation or self-sufficiency through international cooperation. And the background of the 5 new scientists, all of whom have significant foreign exposure, suggests that foreign international science and technological exchange is really key to how China would increase its technological capacity. So once again, indigenous innovation is the goal. It is not the means to achieving the goal. But the dilemma that we see China in today is that with increasing foreign restrictions and difficulty in Chinese investment in overseas technological companies, China is being backed into a position where time and again we see that indigenous innovation is becoming the means. And this is not what Xi Jinping intends from the very beginning, but this is something that is gradually, perhaps in the margin, but like coming to the surface, happening because of a worsening external security environment in China, where China's investment in technological companies around the world is being seen with suspicion, seen as a possible looming national security threat, and seen as a new ground for geopolitical competition. And I think this is something that would have a very serious and negative implication on whether China can achieve technological self-sufficiency. And another thing to bear in mind is when we talk about technology, there are really many things we are talking about. So Xi Jinping also categorizes, different types of technology. China tries to achieve self-sufficiency in what is called essential or core technologies. And Yu Jie did a fantastic job, listing what those are in her paper. So those are areas that China want to achieve some decoupling with the West or with other developed economy for the sake of, minimizing vulnerability. But there are other areas of technology like AI, 5G, biotech, and so on. And they are called, strategic emerging industries. And these are areas where China want to lead and then couple with the world, with China maintaining an upper hand. So Xi Jinping in his speech has specifically said that these are things that would enable China to have leverage over other countries. So we are seeing a dual process of decoupling with the West in advanced technology and also trying to recouple with the world in strategic industries where China tries to lead and China tries to set standard. Thank you.
Yeah, just to come back to you on that, Olivia, I mean, I understand what you're saying, that China's sort of goal is, to be self-reliant and on the way. It needs to make, from its perspective, needs to maintain connections to the outside world. But as you also said, those connections are being cut off, right, by other countries because of the environment we're in. So what's your sense on what Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership is planning to do about that? Because it's highly unlikely that China's sort of next generation of nuclear scientists and AI scientists are going to be allowed to come to the West or Japan and study, because there are new processes in place across the kind of G7 countries explicitly to prevent that. So what is the plan then if China can't rely on the same model of absorbing information and expertise and people from the outside world? How are they going to achieve these very ambitious goals?
I think Yu Jie touched on a really important dimension in her paper on onshoring, science and technological talents from around the world to China, including people who were born in China, who grew up in China, and who studied abroad. They are high targets for attracting them to return to China to contribute to science and technological progress back home. But there is another dimension that we see playing out today on how Beijing actively, persuades Western country that de-risking or decoupling with China is simply unrealistic. And Beijing is also, very actively using diplomacy to try to, charm, Western companies in telling them that, the Chinese market is something is hard to miss, and using them as an entry point to try to gain, influence in policymaking world around Western countries. So the idea is, you exploit the division over there, the open society where Western companies still feel still have a vested interest in investing in China, attract them to come to China, and at the same time also onshoring talents to the greatest extent possible. And to a great extent, the onshoring effort is also helped by, the increasing feeling that Chinese scientists are being unwelcomed or targeted or profiled in America. This has led to, high number of Chinese scientists returning to China So it is very much a fluid process that is happening and is very much also affected by the geopolitics we see today.
Thanks, Olivia. And Eugene, I want to come back to you on this question of the space for critical inquiry in China being squeezed as Xi Jinping has centralized power, and there've been kind of campaign after campaign of sort of political loyalty and centralization of power, because it seems the preconditions for China's sort of earlier phases of innovation, it was partly about that international connection, the ability to bring in outsiders to work and study in China, and for chief Chinese academics and researchers to go overseas. But it was also about the space within China to try and do new things, the space to fail, the fact that there wasn't so much central control in the past when China's economy was growing fast and it was innovating a lot. So how hard do you think it's going to be for the next generation of technocrats and scientists to continue innovating at a time when it seems that the Chinese Communist Party is prioritizing kind of loyalty and following central direction more than in the past?
Well, obviously, Ben, there's a very key question in here, because what Xi Jinping really wants for his China of three key elements. Firstly, is on economic prosperity. As we know, given the current shape of the Chinese economy, that seems to be very hard to go through that post-pandemic recovery. Now, the second key element in here is on technology supremacy. Of course, there's been an inherent contradiction in here is that, well, on the one hand, you wanted to have technology supremacy, but then on the other hand, he also required everyone to have that sense of ideological purity. So what I really call it is really a sense of permanent contradiction in here. So it's not just a reducing space in terms of critical and creative thinking, but I think this also brings a key question in the job market these days, that sense of skill mismatch between the demand and supply on scientists in here. And quite interestingly, in the past, it seems to be working for tech companies and working for fintech companies and so on and so forth is the most fashionable jobs among the Chinese youngsters. But what we have right now is because of that centrality of the party, and that gives so much political space. And that led into the young people consider working for government and working for party organization become something quite fashionable as well. So that sense, somehow, I would call it the implicit brain drain really from the scientific sector and gradually shifted into public sector. And that perhaps would also undermine Beijing's drive on self-reliance on technology and science. And just to give a really interesting number in here, now, earlier this year, when there was a civil service exam being conducted and throughout the Chinese civil service, apparently there are 200,000 jobs available with the total applicants, and many of them are fresh graduate, STEM fresh graduates, and the total applicants number is 7.7 million. So competing for 200,000 jobs, and that just to show you how much working for the government is really in the vogue. So actually what President Xi needs is to have somebody solve the riddance on semiconductor, but then instead you have a large number of young people who want to quit working for civil service, and that is something he might feel happy people want to work for him, but then on the other hand, who's going to solve that science question?
And Neil, obviously China is partly responding to what sort of the US has been doing its allies, as well as Xi Jinping, as Olivia said, having had this kind of deeper goal. And we know that sort of Chinese industrial and Chinese technology policy is not a new thing, of course. But what's your sense in terms of the competitive dynamics between kind of the US and its allies on one hand and China on the other? Do you think that we're going to see this small yard and high fence, as Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, call it, sort of protected technologies? Is that just going to keep expanding? And is the things that China does in response going to lead into a kind of attempted sort of arms race or an escalation of restrictions between both sides? And how do you think the Chinese system is going to manage that in terms of trying to find more domestic sources of innovation, if, it seems likely to me at least, we do see an escalation of these restrictions in the coming years?
Yeah, I would share the view that the restrictions the US is placing on technological interactions with China are only going to expand rather than contract, at least for the foreseeable future, given especially the political dynamics of China on Capitol Hill here in DC. I think there's very little appetite politically, even if there is economically, to roll back even more even blunter and less sophisticated measures like the tariffs that were put on China during the Trump administration. So I think the idea that the Biden administration or a successful administration would roll back the kind of more extensive export controls, say, that were introduced last October on Chinese semiconductor trade and investment with the United States is very unlikely. They're just going to keep expanding. And indeed, there are conversations going on right now about new measures to continue cutting China off from various potential sources of technological exchange with the United States. I mean, one example being the outbound investment restrictions on American firms contributing to kind of high-end Chinese technology ventures. They're likely to come in mid-August, apparently, as far as reporting goes. So I think that competitive dynamic is going to continue. I mean, a big watch point for the pace, which I think is the main variable that we're looking at least for the next few years of this competition, is going to be the American election in November 2024. I think if we saw a change in government, for a change in administration, rather, we could see an acceleration of measures against China and trying to cut off, many more sectors much more quickly from, China's technology development to the United States, which could have a whole series of flow-on effects for American allies as well, depending on how well those regulations and new laws were implemented. So I think that the competitive dynamic is one that's certainly going to increase, and that's going to mean that Xi and the new scientists on the Politburo are going to have to come up with more and better solutions even quicker. And I think Olivia's already kind of been through the kind of suite of options that they've been pursuing. And I think I just note on the talent piece, there is a kind of a huge increase in the focus on trying to foster domestic talent as well, and trying to set up incentives, set up education systems, set up kind of whole career trajectories of kind of rewards and pathways to build the talent that China needs domestically. There's a new section of Xi Jinping's report to the 20th Party Congress last year, one of the world's most boring but consistently structured political reports. But there's a whole new section on technology and talent, which kind of in the arcane world of Pekingology is a hugely significant thing to happen. So it has high level attention. We're actually going to have a new party commission, probably led by Xi himself, that's focused just on science and technology. That's going to be set up probably by the end of the year. It was announced in March, but we don't know yet who is going to be running it or who's going to kind of be the major office holders. That's going to be another kind of big watch point in terms of whether some of these new scientists, maybe someone like Zhang Guoqing, a vice premier, could have relatively senior roles on that body. But it's just focused on science and technology. It's kind of the first really high level party policy coordination body dedicated to this in a long time. So I think that China knows the problem at least and is trying to solve it. But the big question obviously is how much progress they can make. And we get into kind of much more kind of hand-wavy questions about the pace of innovation. And I'm not a technologist, so I don't have any grand theories there. But in terms of the politics of it, I think there is a laser focus on trying to make progress here in Beijing.
Exactly. And I think many governments around the world right now talk about wanting to have a kind of bigger science and technology policy. And what's interesting in China is that you've seen these key people with really deep technical expertise appointed to key political decision-making posts. And that's really quite different from probably almost any country in the world. I mean, answers on a postcard, but is there anyone anywhere else in the world with kind of 4 or 5 people of such sort of high scientific pedigree in the peak kind of political decision-making body of any other country in the world? I doubt it, but I'd be interested to know if there are. Olivia, I want to come back to you on this question of the what I think is a dichotomy between sort of political control and innovation. But having digested Xi Jinping's thoughts, I think you're not convinced that he sees it that way, that there is a Xi Jinping way forward through this apparent dichotomy.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for your question. Well, I think Xi Jinping in many ways agree that, a controlling system doesn't, give rise to innovation, and he sees himself as a person to get rid of control. So by referring to that, I'm talking about one of his speeches where he criticizes university management in China for overburdening, Chinese scientists, scientists who are career academics. He said, if they have to spend so many time attending meetings and conferences, where is the time for research? Hence, the workload and remuneration structure need reforming so that scientists have the freedom and space for research. This is, coming from Xi Jinping himself. So what he sees is that, China's institution is the greatest hurdle for China to achieve indigenous innovation. I think there is a sense that, with time and with, China's, successful diplomacy, there will be enough talents from, advanced countries to contribute to China's innovation goal. And China would be able to, through various means, obtain, advanced technology from companies around the world. But the main problem that he really wants to address is China's structure. And the 5 new scientists that we see being appointed to the Politburo are obviously people who are very familiar with China's innovation structure, not only in academia, but also in state-owned enterprises, in the military, in the defense sector, and so on. So he is bringing them together really to improve coordination throughout China's, innovation system. He sees the whole China, as a national team, universities, you do your innovation and you have to collaborate with, the military or defense sector to contribute to, civil military integration, sharing of technologies. And we also have to commercialize all of them. And then, Chinese, diplomats would take it to, international forums to use it as a chance to shape, global governance norms. How do we govern data? What do we do with AI? What are the limits for, nuclear and so on? So it's a whole chain of process. It's not just, like in the lab and innovating. Xi Jinping wants to maximize positive spillover effects. He wants everything to be coordinated. Hence, we see, new bodies being established, like the one Neil mentioned, a new Central Commission on Science and Technology. And there are also, a lot more different central leading groups established since he came to office to now. And various of them also have a portfolio on science and technology. So what I'm getting at really is that he sees himself as an enabler, not someone coming in with, restriction because of centralization. And we see that also in the institutions that he has created.
Thanks, Olivia. And I think that's you get to an important point there that, from the outside world, maybe there's too much attention on sort of Xi Jinping in control and not enough attention put at the kind of processes and the ways in which he's trying to do things and the space that he maybe sees that we don't see. And I think he probably would win over quite a few academic converts on this call with his call to reduce bureaucracy and administration at universities, which is probably a universal problem. Before we come to questions, and thanks, so many questions already in the Q&A box, but keep them coming. I just have one last issue I want to sort of get into. These scientists are kind of a young generation in Chinese political terms, aged between 59 and 64, probably a young generation in US political terms as well, you might say, these days, somewhat sadly. Yujia, do you think among these 5, are we likely to see kind of future leaders emerge? I mean, are these, in addition to their loyalty and their scientific knowledge, are these 5 new Politburo members people who have kind of ambitions and the potential, do you think, to go even further within China's system?
Well, obviously, according to a convention, according to age limits, naturally, these people would have to progress to the next tiers anyway. But however, as we know that the Chinese elite politics in the past few years has been exception to the rule rather than a rule to the exception in that case. So the answer is we don't know. But what would be really interesting in here is that given those scientists come from quite non-traditional, non-bureaucracy background, and to what extent they will be able to really wielding their influence within the Politburo without actually having a very substantial vested interest groups, like, for example, the old bureaucrats that would have, like, for example, the existing 13 Politburo members, because the other one will have like local interest and they would have vested interest groups behind, but those scientists are less likely so. And I think that's also part of the reason why President Xi picked them up, precisely because they have less heavy political capital within the region and locally, and hence they're more likely to be aligned with Xi Jinping's own priority. And I think that's perhaps would do them a very big tick. But the real influence, and also whether they will become the next generation, we don't know. According to the age, for sure.
And Neil, I think you bravely want to come in on this point.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, just to reinforce Yujia's point that personnel appointments have always been somewhat fickle, but increasingly so in the Xi Jinping era. It's he's bent all the norms about promotion and age that previously provided at least a better guide to who might be rising up the system. But it is also important to note that Xi Jinping didn't totally destroy these norms. Like most people who were promoted to the Politburo, the Standing Committee, did abide by these kind of traditional age norms. There were just quite a few exceptions. So again, for any one particular person, we don't know and we can't say. Especially so far out. I would just add, in terms of looking at these 5 scientists that Yujie has identified on the Politburo, in terms of like who among them might be in the best position to take that next step at the 21st Party Congress in 2027 to get to the Standing Committee, like the top 7 leaders in China. I think that if I had to pick one, it'd be Chen Jining, the party secretary of Shanghai. And he's, again, has all these credentials that Yujie has gone over. He's arguably part of this network of Tsinghua alumni around Xi Jinping, his alma mater. And the most significant kind of signal within the Chinese political system that he's on the way up is that the position he holds. I mean, the party secretary of Shanghai is a role that is traditionally seen as being a kind of stepping stone to that highest level of politics. Every Shanghai party secretary since 1987 has gone on to serve on the Politburo Standing Committee, with one exception, who was done for corruption in the Hu Jintao era, Chen Liangyu. And that's held true during the Xi era. Li Qiang, the current premier, was the party secretary of Shanghai until late last year. And not even the disastrous zero COVID lockdowns that he contributes to, at least, stopped him from rising to that position. So I think that the working assumption should be that Chen Jining gets promoted to the Politburo Standing Committee. Again, not guaranteed. He could do a bad job in Shanghai. He could just not be in Xi's favor in 4 years' time. We don't know. But he'd be the kind of the top pick from this group. Another one to watch would be Li Ganjie, who's relatively young, had a lot of very varied experience across bureaucracies and local government, generally a good sign for someone rising through the system. And he currently runs the organization department, which is, looks after personnel and promotion decisions, an extremely politically important and sensitive position that, can also be a launching pad for that next step to the Standing Committee.
Thanks, Neil. And just Olivia, to come to you on this question or related question. I mean, do you think the disappearance of former Foreign Minister Qin Gang will have these 5 other sort of Xi Jinping picks sleeping a bit nervously? Do you think within China, I mean, obviously outside it's got a lot of intrigue, within the sort of elite Chinese politics, do you think other sort of captain's picks are now wondering if being a Xi Jinping favorite is actually as good a place to be as it was a few months ago?
Well, I think being very close to someone very powerful is never a very comfortable position. So Qin Gang's, mysterious disappearance and then removal confirmed that. But I think a wider question here is whether Xi Jinping would take any major steps in trying to reestablish new norms to govern Chinese elite politics. We talked about how Chinese elite politics under Xi Jinping quite often seem to be, exceptions rather than the norm. And he himself breaking protocol to have an unprecedented 3rd term is a very major exception. And there are also exceptions of how his loyalists do not really reflect the age limit, and they are reflected in the highest leadership in China. So there are various exceptions we can cite. But in the long term, if Xi Jinping, given the current, all signals indicate that he already has centralized power quite impressively, and that is quite likely going to continue, safe under a health issue that Xi Jinping cannot overcome. So safe under that possibility, Xi Jinping is there to stay. All signs indicate that. So given that is most likely a reality, is he going to do things to make it a lot smoother and a lot more stable, and also to prepare for what happened when he has to leave the scene? And to do all those, he would have to establish norms and conventions to stabilize elite politics and also to regulate how competition works. I think the uncertainty surrounding how to really get ahead and what would be sufficient to take you down are things that would really harm stability of the Chinese leadership. And these are things that are not to his interest, and they are also very much against his concern for regime stability and regime legitimacy. So I think what we are really waiting to see, like what are the steps he is going to take to create greater normalization in these areas, other than just using the corruption investigation machine to take down people when he thinks it is necessary.
Thanks, Olivia. I'm going to go to some of the questions now from the audience. I'm going to start with one which I'll paraphrase from Claire Bailey, and I might ask you first on this, Neil, but if Olivia or UJ want to jump in, just let me know, feel free. So Claire's basically asking about Western export controls and investment screening regimes, which were designed to make it harder for China to attain technological superiority. So Neil, do you think they're working, or is there a risk that they're going to backfire, that in a sense, these kind of Western restrictions are going to accelerate China's sort of shift towards indigenous innovation?
And that's the big question, right? And I think the answer is that it's too early to tell at the moment, because I mean, we're talking technological developments and a potential, AI arms race, if you like, that could go on for 5, 10, many more decades, many years. So the time horizon that's important is kind of hard to tell. And it's, one shouldn't discount the possibility that China makes faster than expected progress, or has some technological breakthroughs that really accelerate that process. I mean, I think the weight of kind of experts, kind of technologist opinion on this is that the export controls and various other measures are certainly making it more difficult and are slowing the progress that China would otherwise make. But there are real side effects. A lot of Western technology companies, semiconductor companies, see a kind of significant and very current example, made a lot of money from China. That was a big part of their revenues. And so if that gets increasingly cut off at a rate that outstrips, their ability to diversify into other markets or to find other sources of revenue, then that could potentially reduce the resources available for further innovation. That's the kind of the running ahead hypothesis, as it's called, that this could actually backfire because the revenues China is generating for these companies is what's actually helping them to stay ahead of the competition in China. And I think it's an open question. I think it's one that certainly doesn't get enough attention in Western capitals, even if the direction of travel might be totally understandable. There is a need to consider what the longer term consequences might be.
Thanks, Neil. And related to that, UJ, I might come to you. There've been a lot of questions about sort of talent attraction back to China. And one part of that is, do we think it's going to undermine Western ambitions in scientific development, of losing these Chinese talents who are going back home? But also, there's been a few questions about, specifically, what is China doing to attract scientific talents back? What are the specific incentives that are on offer? Or are they just relying on Western governments to alienate a lot of Chinese researchers in their own right?
Well, to answer your second question, I think the Western sanctions and also Western initiatives targeted to Chinese scientists has really inadequately helped China's talent reshoring process. So they have actually accelerated, but I would not necessarily consider it as being the key factor. One of the key factors in here, as I said earlier, is about this infrastructure, which including financial resources and physical institutions that would allow scientists to have sufficient capabilities to play with the sense of either it's a basic research or applied research. I mean, the number I gave earlier is the salary of the researchers, and also throughout report, in this report and research paper, what I found is that it has been really well written within the 14th 5 years plan that published a couple of years ago, and said for any science researchers and who have studied and worked substantially abroad. And if you could bring a team of researchers and you'll be offered a seed fund of $600,000 a year. So that is a precise number already beginning there. And actually in the time of, for example, Li Ganjie, in the time when he was the party secretary of Shandong, and he was even asking his following bureaucrats deliberately try to design certain programs in order to attract talents back home. That process of talents reshoring process has already been put into the appraisal process for the Chinese officials and to indicate how many numbers of talents you have been attracted. So I think there has been some concrete measures in here. Now, this also come back to the institutional memory that the Chinese Communist Party had towards the Soviet Union at the end of 1950 when you had the China-Soviet split. And hence that actually incentivized the Chinese scientists and creating a much advanced science programs than something to be gave up. So come back to the earlier question you asking me about it. I think the answer is really remain unknown. But really for the moment, the scale of science and innovation within China, perhaps much bigger than that sense of edge, that tiny little bit edge and competing with the United States. Yeah.
Thanks, Yujie. And Olivia, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thank you. I think for a lot of scientists with huge ambition, going to China can be really quite an attractive option, because you are given really generous funding, good research support, good facilities. So just put away the politics. It makes a lot of sense. And the Chinese government has a range of policies to very actively attract talents from around the world to China. And one of these include, global talent spotting competitions. And quite often they are organized even, from the embassies around the world, Chinese embassies around the world. And they are very major competitions. One of them being the Chunhui Cup. It has been an annual event for over a decade already. And there are also, science and innovation parks set up in China with, satellite branches overseas, and they are specifically for overseas returnees. Many of them from China, and some of them are not from China initially. So the other thing to bear in mind is that Xi Jinping reckons that despite all these policies, there would still be, Chinese scientists or ethnic Chinese scientists who prefer to stay abroad. So he said specifically that China is now looking at flexible talent introduction. What he means is the talents can stay overseas, but their skills would be coming back to China. So there are various flexible schemes to allow for that, including they come to China for a month, a year, and to supervise a research team. Then they go back overseas to do their own research. And the research team in China would also be supported by a commercialization team to try to take the idea to the market. So there is significant coordination involved to try to get talents, get their know-how as much as possible.
Yeah, I like the idea of these, like Sing China, but for science and technology. It's quite an interesting idea. We've had quite a few questions about Taiwan, which I guess is an inevitability in any Chatham House event or any think tank event where we're discussing Chinese politics and the economy. But particularly on this question of science and technology, Neil, I might come to you, and everyone else feel free to join in if you want. But I mean, do you think that sort of invading Taiwan would be part of China's sort of plans for scientific innovation? I guess the questioners here are particularly thinking about semiconductors and TSMC. So would it make sense to have that as part of the reasons why you might invade Taiwan, to get hold of their semiconductor technology?
I mean, it's possible. We can't read Xi Jinping's mind, but I don't think so. Invading Taiwan would be one of the most disruptive things you could possibly do for international supply chains that underpin this type of scientific research and technological production. There's still quite a lot of trade in semiconductors, outside the cutting edge, but it's still quite a lot of trade between China and Taiwan in these areas, and other kind of electronics too. The supply chains that go right across the world, like 40% of global supply chains roughly, traverse or go past Taiwan. So any kind of war or occupation and the kind of sanctions that would result would be extremely costly and disruptive, and likely trigger some kind of geopolitical recession as well across the world. So I think that it it doesn't make sense from a kind of innovation point of view to make that kind of leap. And I think as well, when we talk about specific things like TSMC plants, I think that it's highly likely that they would be destroyed, perhaps intentionally, rather than be allowed to fall into Chinese hands. And then also, even if China did get its hands on them, there's a huge set of management processes and kind of embedded knowledge that you need to operate the machinery and the kind of factory infrastructure there that China doesn't seem to have from its own kind of limited progress at the cutting edge of semiconductors in particular. So I don't think it's a huge part of any kind of imminent plan to invade Taiwan.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Neil. We've had quite a few questions about the environment and climate change, and I might ask you about this, Yujie. I mean, yeah, how far do you think that the Chinese leadership sees this kind of push for innovation and technological development as part of the kind of answer to or response to climate change? Or are these sort of separate issues in a way? On the one hand, you have the kind of high technology that's about China's national security and sort of economic prowess and superiority, and then sort of managing climate change is a different kind of bucket of issues.
It's not necessarily a different bucket of issues. I think it's actually quite related. So Xi Jinping has introduced the so-called new approach or holistic approach of national security. So environmental degradation was actually part of a worry that he would wake him up in the middle of the night. So it's not necessarily two separate issues. But I think what we need to be very clear in here is environmental protection, climate change, that will really fall into the part of the so-called governing legitimacy question of the party. Maybe not necessarily really is the question for international cooperation. I think, of course, the Western political leaders and environmentalist community would like to believe that China willing to put forward cooperation on climate change and do the talk is a part of that influence that Western advanced economies give it to China. But I think really for the Chinese Communist Party, it is not international question, it's a domestic governance question. So I would not necessarily really linked up with science and innovation regarding how to against China from external shock into something that environment related. It's more about domestic political agenda.
Thanks, Yujie. We're coming up to time, just a couple of minutes left. So I might come to each of you with just a final broad question. If you could do your best to answer it very succinctly, that would be great. We've talked a lot about the different ambitions that are laid out, but I just want to ask simply, I mean, do you think China is on target to achieve these ambitions? Do you think this new model of indigenous development of science and technology, whether by design or by necessity, do you think it's actually on track to be a success within the goals that Xi Jinping has set? And let's maybe go in reverse order. So start with Olivia, then Neil, and then Yujie.
I think it is on track to achieve something, but not as much as what Xi Jinping has hoped for. So he also is pragmatic enough to say that China need an alternative for every critical supply. Now, when you talk about an alternative, what he also means is if China cannot produce like to like what it import from advanced countries, at least we make something that is good enough for the purpose. So by really even talking about that, to me that is a signal that he is very aware that the difficulties are very, very, very stiff. And if he can achieve something close to what he has set out for, self-sufficiency, but not to the highest quality, that would be considered a success already.
Thanks, Olivia. And Neil.
I think Olivia's right on the money, and China's going to make progress. But I think, achieving technological independence and self-reliance in all of these so-called chokehold technologies would be a phenomenal achievement in just a few years. So I think it would take a lot of time, and it's unlikely to be fully successful. But even if China's innovation process isn't efficient from a market point of view in terms of just throwing a huge amount of resources at it, it can still be effective to a significant degree.
Thanks, Neil. And Yujie.
Well, I think it's a really end in itself question or mean to the end. I think what we haven't covered in here is that Xi Jinping is also very keen to using technology self-reliance as a way of channeling all this excessive capital in the property sector into something drive China to become innovative, knowledge-based economy. So I think that's also back down the bigger question. If you give up the GDP growth through property sector, can China using innovation alone to drive GDP growth? And perhaps the answer remains very unclear until this day.
Thanks so much to you, Jer, to Neil, and to Olivia, and thanks to my colleague Chloe Sageman as well for helping organize this webinar. Do look out for Jer's paper if you haven't already read it, which is on our website and link in the chat as well. And keep an eye out on our Asia Pacific program page for future events. But yes, thanks so much again for joining us today. Thanks to all the panelists, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.